My name is Jon Gosier. I run a fund, venture capital fund that does technology investment here in the United States, but we also invest in Africa, in African technology companies, which I've been doing for about 6 or 7 years now. I started a software company in 2008 in Uganda, a company called Africa, Appfrica. And essentially what Africa does is we help multinational companies who want to do business in Africa do business in Africa. So we help them find talent, we help them do market research, we help them develop technology products. A lot of people don't know, which you may have just heard in Eric's just panel, Africa has some of the densest mobile penetration in the world, second only to Asia in terms of numbers, but in terms of impact and what it actually means to society, it's probably number one, because the mobile industry is completely changed the way the continent is able to do business within its own borders, but also with the rest of the world. And actually, just prior to this, we had a conversation with some people in another room where we were talking about what does that mobile market mean for Africa's economies. Well, just to give you an example, the largest cell phone company, the largest bank in Kenya is a cell phone company, Safaricom, which now passes 12% of Kenya's GDP through its networks for people who are using an app called M-Pesa. It's incredibly transformative. What that allows is for Africans Kenyans to transfer money, receive payroll, send money to loved ones, all from their mobile phone. And when we talk about mobile phones in Africa, we're not talking about smartphones. We're talking about what are called feature phones. So feature phones being the most basic phones that we used maybe 15, 20 years ago here in the States, and that's what's there now. Africa right now is going through what I call its third act. So the first act is represented by the black and white slide that you see here, basically colonialism, which was transformative in all the wrong ways for the continent. But what it did represent was the first time the world saw Africa as a business opportunity. And that spanned, for hundreds of years, essentially an extractive relationship with the continent. It was human capital that was being extracted, people that were being extracted, and the land was kind of being occupied, right? Some of those relationships were good, most of them were bad and horribly detrimental to the development of the continent. The second wave began in the beginning of the 20th century, and that was extractive resources. So that was extracting diamonds, oil, other minerals that are in abundance in Africa that the rest of the world needs. And that continued all the way up until the aughts, 2000. What's great about what's going on in Africa right now is the relationship that the continent has with the rest of the world is changing for a number of reasons. It's no longer an extractive relationship. It's no longer oppressive. It's more of a relationship between Africa's people, its countries, its governments, and companies abroad. What that means is Africa now has leverage. It can be a participant in its own story. So what you see on the slide on the right represents the growing African middle class. That is a consumer base that everyone in the world is intrigued by and trying to figure out. My company, Africa, which I told you about, has done work with a lot of those companies to reach African consumers because this is a new market for them. It's a new understanding. It's new cultural context that they have to deal with. The other thing that's changing about Africa is geopolitically, it's becoming more relevant because it is the nexus between the Western world and the Eastern world. And it's so big that it can't be ignored, right? And for the Eastern economies, they see Africa as a great trade partner, which is something that the West and Europe has never really explored. Everything that we've done has been more diplomatic, it's been more charity, it's been aid, etc. The relationship with China is, you have what we need, here's some money, we're going to go home and we're going to use it there, which I actually think is healthier because at least Africa has a choice as to whether or not it's going to participate. So when I talk about opportunities in Africa, I'm talking about the economic opportunities, and the reason why I focus on the economic opportunities in the continent is because just like everywhere else in the world, businesses they build jobs, they will transform the continent in a way that philanthropy and aid can't. Those are tools of diplomacy, and they're great tools, but they're not the only thing anywhere else in the. They're not the only thing that drive anything anywhere else in the world. So why would we expect it to be the only thing that will work in Africa? So what I do in Africa is all about business, private equity, and how to scale opportunities for young people and really everyone. So what you see here is that there is a rapid rise in the number of African companies that are going public, what's called listed companies, across the continent. Africa has 22 stock exchanges, I think, and those exchanges trade. They're also increasingly started to be traded on by the international markets, so investors here are looking at opportunity there. The reason why that's is happening is because Africa is one of the few places in the world that is growing at a rate that is really attractive to even the most risk adverse investor. Some countries 10% per annum, which is incredible. To put it in context, the United States is growing at about 1%, actually 0.1%, depending on when you measure it. Europe is certainly around 0% growth right now. Some African countries are getting 10% growth. That's a huge opportunity for investors, and it's real opportunities. That growth is not an anomaly. It's been going on since the 60s. It's palpable. You can see it on the ground when you're in some of these countries. Every time I go to Kenya or Uganda, all I see is cranes everywhere. It's just really exciting to see and be a part of. So if you look at the yellow countries in this map, these are what are all what are now classified as middle-income countries in Africa. Most people, when they think of Africa, if I ask them what middle-income countries were here, the whole map would be gray, except for maybe South Africa and Egypt. That's not the case. Even places like Sudan, which is going through a number of issues right now, still qualify as middle income. And it's all relative. I mean, it's not middle income as you and I, but it's the metrics that the World Bank and the United Nations use to qualify whether the median income per individual in a country is above or below the poverty line. These countries qualify as above. That's exciting. It's the first time in history, it's the first time in recent history that Africa's looked like that. You can't see most of this, but basically it just quantifies the growth of the continent, 7% per average for if you look at all the continent as a whole. The other thing that's really interesting is that you have now 327 million Africans who qualify as middle income. So of the people from those countries that were yellow, that's 327 million people, most of them in Nigeria, about 70 million. And what that means is, this is a huge economy that's waiting to be tapped by businesses, by the private sector. What I think the opportunity for us, the people in this room, is if you're having trouble innovating here at home, don't forget, this is a big world. Africa presents lots of opportunities. Asia presents opportunities. South America presents opportunities. But in the case of Africa, they're frontier opportunities, meaning you don't have to push anybody else out the way. You'll be the first, more or less, doing whatever it is you're trying. And that's an incredible opportunity that if you were, let's say, 400 years ago and people were starting to look at the Americas, people would leap for those opportunities. Africa is the same way right now, and you can build amazing companies there. There's just so much that can be done. So basically the point of this slide is that the global diaspora, and when I say that, I mean African Americans, Caribbean Americans, African Europeans, French Africans, doesn't matter. If you're from Africa and you've gone somewhere else, I consider you part of the global diaspora. Some people will use that term differently. They'll talk about the diaspora as recent African immigrants. I don't care about that. Everybody's included, in my opinion. But if you just look at the African immigrants, recent African immigrants and expatriates to other countries, the amount of money that's sent home in remittances is about $62 billion, which is more than the amount of money Africa receives in foreign direct investment. I think that's an opportunity. Why are we sending money back and not investing, right? That's $62 billion. Imagine what that would look like if it was in the form of concentrated growth to the continent. It's just something to think about. If you include African Americans, we control about $1 trillion in consumer spending capital here in the United States. Imagine if those outflows of capital were doing more business with Africa. I think it would be a very different place. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I do and I wanted to give you the context in which why I'm so excited about Africa and why my company, Africa, does what it does. Next slide. So the other thing that people should remember about the continent is around 70% of the continent is under the age of 30. So there is an incredible amount of youth that is on the continent, the people of working age who don't have very many opportunities. When I started my company, I saw this, and so one of the things that I started to do was invest in young technology companies. Not necessarily because those companies are going to be massive companies, though they may, but it's because if you don't present palpable, real opportunities for that many young people, then bad things start to happen. We've seen this in Egypt, right? You have critical mass of young people who are frustrated and their governments aren't taking care of them. They have no voice. What do we think is going to happen? On one hand, this could be an incredibly exciting story. It could be, a huge renaissance in Africa. On the other hand, it could be a total nightmare. You have this many young people with no opportunities. You have growing terrorism. You have growing negative forces on the continent. It could go the wrong direction. And so our company invests in trying to get things going in that right direction as opposed to the wrong direction. One of the initiatives I started when I was in Uganda was called Hive Collab. Hive Collab is similar to some of the co-working spaces that you see around the world, like Hub, or I think here in Miami you have Pipeline and others that are coming. But the idea is it's a community where anyone can come and use the space to build a business without having to spend a lot of money, without having to pay for internet. They have to pay for a desk, but it's very minimal expense. They don't have to get an office. So the cost of doing business for young people has been lowered dramatically because of places like this. And I think Eric touched upon the fact that there's many hubs like this now across the continent. This is a shot of the space, young coders, business development people, guys with great ideas, creatives, NGOs as well. I mean, in Uganda, when nonprofits, when governments, when people who are new to the country come to Kampala, which is Entebbe is the capital, but which is the big city in Uganda, they come to our place because they know that this is where they can tap into the pulse of what all these young people are doing in the country. In Kenya, it's the iHub. In Nigeria, it's a place called CC Hub. In Ghana, it's a place called I forget, but there's one in Ghana. Next slide. There's one in almost every African country now. So the orange countries are the places where there are hubs like this. And I actually was the co-founder of a group called Afro Labs, which connects all of the hubs across the continent. So one of the things we observed was people like yourselves who had an interest in Africa, and they're like, man, this place is huge. It's, 3 or 4 times the size of the United States. It's so far away. I don't have the capital. All these reasons why people were afraid of doing business with Africa. And they were like, I just want one group to talk to find out all the opportunities on the continent. So we started Afro Labs for that purpose, to connect all of the activity in all of these countries. So whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're a Coke or a Pepsi, you can talk to that one group and reach everybody else. It's a nonprofit. We didn't do it because we wanted to control all the deal flow. We did it to make it easier to get business in the continent. Because one thing I talk to other African investors about is, in order for us all to succeed, we have to share opportunity. It can't be, like a territorial type thing. The stakes are too high, and other people don't do that. So why should we? We just need to spread the wealth, and as the continent prospers, everybody who's doing business here will as well. I talked about the hub side of things, which is our way of giving back to first the country that I was in, Uganda, but then the rest of the continent. When I talk about the private sector, that all came in the form of the funds, the Africa Fund. So we started investing in companies across the continent based on the thesis that I just talked about. It's a growing economy. There's opportunity all over the continent. So how can we best catalyze that growth? And my thought was, let's invest in companies. And the reason why investment's important is because it's unrestricted. The thing people don't realize about oftentimes don't realize about grants and aid and all of this is it comes with a caveat. It's like, we're going to do this for you. You need to do this for us. That's the unwritten message about all the billions of dollars that go to Africa every year. It's essentially controlling those governments to do what the donor governments want. The private sector doesn't have that problem, and it can move way faster because it has less bureaucracy. And again, your $50 billion going over to the Nigerian government does absolutely nothing for the 15-year-old who can't find a job. It just doesn't. It doesn't get there fast enough. By the time it gets to him, he's 35. So it's useless. So we just invest directly into the private sector and young people through the Africa Fund. These are some of the investments we've made. There's lots of different things, just the diversity of entrepreneurs. It's not really about any particular country. It's really about the idea and the tenacity and the passion of whoever is founding the business. We actually got the seed for the funds. So the initial capital for the fund came from the profits of Africa. We started reinvesting into the continent. But then we received a pretty sizable grant partnership with the US Department of State, which I thought was important because they would have used that money to do something that was more traditional. And again, we talked about how that aid doesn't always work. And so basically our argument to them was, why don't you work with us and help us invest in these companies, and we'll do this in a different way, right? Like, how do we change the way diplomacy is performed and work with the private sector, which was us, and get it to people who need it, which is young people like these. The thing that I would leave you with is just that the opportunities in Africa, it's not really some people will tell you it's about going back to Africa and, it's like all this stuff. That is relevant. But the reason why it matters is because there's an economic boom going on across the continent, and I don't think the diaspora anywhere in the world should be left out. I don't want to go back to Nigeria in 30 years and have the majority of the business I do with the Chinese. I like doing business with the Chinese, but it's Africa, right? And it's our opportunity to help it stay that way, and we can do that. And also generate wealth for people here. And the lack of economic opportunity here, to me, says something. If there's no demand in America for services and the resources that it has, then why can't other places use those resources and talent and services to its advantage? So thank you for listening, and I look forward to Q&A later.